This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track, and ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. We've noticed a funny thing about President Trump and his chief propagandist, Caroline Leavitt. She routinely fluffs Trump with astonishingly cult-like descriptions of him to reporters, ones that portray him as powerful, calm, and completely in command of events. But then, left to his own devices on Truth Social, Trump presents the opposite picture, erupting regularly in wild meltdowns and uncontrollable hissy fits over the tiniest of slights. We just saw a particularly unsettling version of this tension play out. Leavitt went full North Korea with a number of worshipful monologues about Trump to reporters. Yet around the same time, a reporter's criticism of Trump caused him to explode in a wild, triggered fury. This doesn't seem like a good way to run the executive branch of a great nation, so we're going to try to dig through all this with Salon columnist Amanda Marcotte, who knows how to read MAGA pathologies, particularly male ones, like nobody else. Amanda, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Caroline Leavitt. At the press briefing on Friday, Leavitt was asked if Trump will visit some of the sites of private real estate deals that his company has made in the Middle East during his upcoming trip there. Then this happened.
Let me just get to the premise of your question that both of you have raised. I think it's frankly ridiculous that anyone in this room would even suggest that President Trump is doing anything for his own benefit. He left a life of luxury and a life of running a very successful real estate empire for public service, not just once, but twice. And again, the American public reelected him back to this White House because they trust he acts in the best interests of our country and putting the American public first. This is a president who has actually lost money for being president of the United States.
Now, Trump is easily the most corrupt, self-dealing president ever to occupy the Oval Office. He's ripping off the place relentlessly. But that aside, Amanda, note how Leavitt starts by portraying Trump as this humble, self-sacrificing figure, but then immediately segues into this unctuous, obsequious, hilariously over-the-top flattery of him because she knows that's what he wants to hear. Your thoughts?
Sometimes I wonder how his base reacts to this. I assume most of them aren't watching this kind of thing, but it's so obviously just for him. And I think there's a secondary purpose, of course, which is to trigger the liberals like you and me who are like, oh my God, that's such an outrageous lie that it's offensive. It's gaslighting. And you know, they get a rise out of us. And that I think is part of the pleasure of this. But yeah, it's quite wild how much of his narcissism is just the neediness of his just getting out of control. She got this job for two reasons. One, she looks the part, and two, she's utterly shameless at feeding just over the top praise to Donald Trump. That's the main, like, not just for her job, though, especially her job, but it seems like that's the main purpose of much of his cabinet.
Well, speaking of being over the top, you had a piece recently for Salon in which you talked about the MAGA aesthetic and the degree to which it turns on wildly exaggerated imagery of all kinds, Trump's gold-plated tastelessness, as you put it. Then there's also the Mar-a-Lago face, the really kind of crazy plastic surgery jobs and crazy makeup jobs on prominent MAGA women, the steroided out bodies, which are sometimes attached to Donald Trump, which I find funny because that guy is McDonald's from top to bottom. And this is not a fit guy. And they just stick that body on him. And same with Pete Hegseth, right? They show him the same way. It occurs to me that this Levitt performance that we see regularly is a little similar to that. As you say, she looks the part. She got the job partly because of that. But it's the exaggeration of the praise that's the key, right? The over-the-top nature of it, that's the key. Can you talk about that?
The thing that's so fascinating is this is true about the MAGA aesthetic in every way. Every emotion is exaggerated to the maximum. They pretend to be angry at the loudest volume. They tend to be sad with the biggest droopy faces and wailing tears. Everything's loud and garish and schmaltzy. After I wrote that piece, a lot of people on Blue Sky pointed out that I overlooked the pro wrestling angle of it, of which I felt I kicked myself really hard because that's exactly right. The aesthetic is borrowed directly from pro wrestling, where every emotion is both very one note and just completely over the top. And the way that people look is heavily exaggerated to cartoonish proportions. The plastic surgery isn't about looking better, but about looking almost uncannily unhuman, like just so exaggerating your femininity. And then, the men, they like the roided out body. Most of the men aren't willing to put themselves through that kind of torture to get it. But, RFK loves to whip off his shirt in public to show off those totally natural muscles on a 70-year-old man.
It occurs to me that when Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, went down to El Salvador, she kind of posed in front of all these, again, exaggerated images of dark criminals in the background. And she was very decked out for that, right?
That's the dark side of this, especially. They have put out a lot of both AI generated and real photographic imagery of over-the-top abuse of these migrants that they've captured and functionally kidnapped and renditioned to a foreign prison. And they shaved their heads. They made sure to make their tattoos as garish as possible. They had videos of them bent over, in these torture positions. And you see the effect that it has on the audiences at Trump's 100-day rally. The crowd went absolutely nuts.
To stay up to date on all the news that you need to know, there's no better place than right here on the DSR Network. And there's no better way to enjoy the DSR Network than by becoming a member. Members enjoy an ad-free listening experience, access to our Discord community, exclusive content, and more. Use code DSR2025 for a 40% off discount on sign-up at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code DSR2025 at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Let's go to another Levitt moment. She was asked about another Trump policy, his effort to gut the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Listen to this exchange.
Yesterday, the administration appears to have started dismantling the Consumer Product Safety Commission. This is the federal agency, an independent one that does recalls and is responsible for product safety. Does the administration not believe that it's important, to keep toys and cribs? I mean, you're a young mom off of the product of the market.
It's a federal agency within which branch? It's the executive branch. Who's the head of the executive branch? The President of the United States. He has
Congress.
He has the right to fire people within the executive branch. It's a pretty simple answer.
Now, I think what got Levitt mad there was that the reporter pointed out that she, meaning Levitt, is a young mom. Note how Levitt says, in essence, this decision is the right one because Trump has the power to do it and because Trump decided to exercise his power this way, period. Full stop. This is supposed to show Trump firmly in command, but it actually shows that she feels the need to satisfy his incredibly fragile ego by publicly abusing this reporter who dared to ask the Mad King to justify his policies. Again, a show for Trump, right?
Yes, and it shows that I think there's a lot of people that are asking the question, why isn't anyone standing up to Donald Trump inside the White House on this tariff policy? Now, that question was about consumer safety, but I think this is incredibly related because the tariff policy is going to create massive problems for him politically, especially when it already is. And then when people actually start seeing the empty shelves and rising prices, it's going to be a serious problem. But we see with Levitt's behavior that everyone around Trump, their only job is to make him feel good about himself. And he's a narcissist. So that's just this constant nonstop struggle. Like a narcissism is both an overblown ego and like an insecurity underneath it. That tension is is why they constantly need all this praise and being told they're the greatest and the best and no one's smarter, better, more in charge or any of that stuff. So I think we're going to see this get a lot worse the more his approval ratings plummet. And I worry that he's going to end up getting even more in his bubble of believing everything he's doing is right because everyone around him is going to escalate the praise instead of leveling with him that like his policies are making him unpopular.
You know, I think you put your finger on why there's this sort of cringeworthy quality to it. This combination of the need to constantly praise him and treat him as this world historically great figure. And at the same time, it's so obvious they're ministering to this deep, unslakable insecurity. It's that tension that makes it so cringeworthy, like almost car wreck-like.
You hear the word narcissist flung around a lot on the internet, but narcissism is actually a pretty rare condition. And I think, any psychologist will say Trump is just a very obvious example of it. But I think it's hard for most of us to understand what it's like to be in the shoes of somebody who has this particular set of personality disorders, because most of us would be embarrassed to have somebody praise us like that because we know it's not true. Like if somebody came up to me and was like, Amanda, you're the greatest writer of all time, I would wonder, I would be scared of them. I would want to run away. I'd be ashamed. That would make me feel bad, but he just needs it to just be constantly coming into his ears. And it's getting worse as he ages for various reasons. And any psychologist will also tell you that when narcissists are feeling insulted or they're feeling their insecurity rise up often because their approval ratings are going down or they're otherwise failing, their need to be told they're the greatest just continues to go up.
It's interesting that you say that because it literally is what his people say to him, that he's the greatest ever. They say that during the cabinet meetings. They say greatest president ever, even though everybody knows that that's a complete joke. They say it anyway. I want to switch to one more Levitt moment. Reporter Andrew Egger of The Bulwark asked about Trump's ongoing crypto grift. Listen to this.
The president posted another ad this week for his Trump meme coin. The group that's running that coin is encouraging people to buy in order to win a dinner this month with the president. Why is the president planning to attend a dinner for the top investors in his coin?
Look, the president is abiding by all conflict of interest laws. The president has been incredibly transparent with his own personal financial obligations throughout the years. The president is a successful businessman, and I think, frankly, it's one of the many reasons that people reelected him back to this office.
So, Amanda, we're back to the idea that Trump is an absolute paragon of public integrity. But note that here again, Levitt has to slip in the fawning about Trump being a hugely successful businessman. What do you think?
Yeah, they say that because he's not. He's a total failure. It does kind of show, though, like that this MAGA over the top aesthetic, this is performed for him, right? To feed his narcissism. But it does sort of give me insight into the way that this over the top, like, I don't want to say campiness of MAGA, because camp is fun and joyful and this is just gross. But the over the top nature of it, I think weirdly does affect certain people by convincing them. I don't think like Trump's voters, even his biggest fans, think he's the greatest president of ever, the person with the most integrity of all time. No person has ever been anything more than Donald Trump ever has. I don't think they would agree with that. But the constant repetition of things like he's the greatest businessman of all time causes, I think, an unconscious, like, reinforcing the idea that he was at least a successful businessman, right? When the opposite is true. He was a failure. He bankrupted his company over and over and over again. And if it wasn't for the constant bailouts from his father and his rich friends, like, he would just be nobody. And I think that we get very similar vibes with a lot of the other over-the-top praise that is offered to him. I do think it sends in it kind of teaches and coaches his voters to think, well, he must be at least somewhat good, or else these people would just burst into flames from the shame of this. But that's just not how any of this works.
Well, your point about the reality of Trump brings us to the finale here. MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle did a segment on Friday criticizing Trump's tariffs, and he exploded. He tweeted, quote, "I just watched an exhausted, highly neurotic Stephanie Ruhle spew lies about tariffs, as do many others, in order not to give me the victory that they all see coming. Few people know Stephanie Ruhle, but I do, and she doesn't have what it takes. We're going to make a fortune with tariffs. Only smart people understand that, and Stephanie was never known as a high IQ person." There was a lot more like that. Amanda, I think it's worth noting that in her segment, Stephanie Ruhle cited the fact that a lot of prominent and very male businessmen have said Trump's tariffs will crush us economically, but just note the misogyny in his wild rant. He sounded kind of hysterical. I think this cuts against the North Korea state TV image that Levitt worked so hard to cultivate. What do you think?
I agree with you, to, I think, normal people, to people who didn't vote for Trump, were like, he is an emotionally incontinent child. He can't control his temper. He can't control his feelings. He flips out at the slightest provocation. He's got the thinnest skin I've ever seen in a human being. But one of the most fascinating things that has emerged about the MAGA aesthetic is that they've really kind of repositioned like the childish temper tantrum as almost a show of strength. So you see like a lot, and I wrote about this at Swan, but you see like a lot of really performative temper tantrum throwing from Trump acolytes. Brett Kavanaugh, I think, obviously was the most famous, like, early example of somebody who realized, if I just get into this screaming spittle rage on national television, that's going to read to Trump like, I'm a firm leader in control of the situation. And it's funny to me because all these people always talk about like John Wayne, or Trump has been talking about Sean Connery a lot, right? And the movie idols that they think of as masculine or like calm, in control, the sort of person that Levitt is describing. But on TV, it's actually performed as, volume to 11, red face screaming. And Trump's, true socials are in the same aesthetic. It's a weird contradiction. I do think that's why the pro wrestling metaphor was so good, because no one in pro wrestling is, an understated, calm, collected, silent leader,
I think a lot of this has to do with Trump kind of coming of age in the media in the 1980s and 1990s in New York. I grew up in New York and I was around that tabloid culture. I actually spoke to Trump back in the day when I worked at another newspaper in the 1990s. And he was kind of the same person, but without the darkness, without the dark fascism. He was just a, relentless pitch man. And this was a guy who knew how to play the tabloids. He knew how to set up conflicts with people like Al Sharpton. He really understood that type of aesthetic. And I wonder if that is sort of the precursor to this. What we've got in a way is a mixing of 1980s tabloid New York and full-blown fascist authoritarian imagery. Is that maybe the way to think about it?
Yeah, and I would add reality TV, where he also has a lot of experience into the mix. This is not the zone of like subtle emotion. These are the spaces where everything is about grabbing people's attention and shaking them by the lapels. That's always been a part of American culture. I don't even necessarily like hate it. Like, I think bombast and over the top ridiculousness can be really fun in a lot of situations. And I think one of the reasons Donald Trump was fun in the 80s and 90s and seemed kind of harmless to people was that he was in this clownish aesthetic. But it's also true that traditionally fascism embraces an over the top aesthetic. And it does so.
And a buffoonish one.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I think people think of Nazis like goose stepping in the streets, and that's supposed to be intimidating, but it was also received at the time as ridiculous because it was so over the top. And in contrast, I think with like the way in the 1930s, most people's aesthetic was a little bit like more calm. There were Hollywood musicals, but all that, but like people thought Hitler was a clown. Mussolini, very clownish figure. Fascist leaders in general are loud, buffoonish. They have stupid hair. Look at the autocrats around the world. They all love a bad haircut. And one of the reasons is you can't look away. It's the car crash mentality of getting attention. I think the other really important thing to understand about these like very loud aesthetics is they're about turning off your brain. They overwhelm you with emotion so that you just can't think. If you've ever been to a Trump rally, and it's a miserable experience, it's ear-splittingly loud. They play this schmaltzy music at top volume. You really do have to leave in order to think. I always end up not writing on location because there's just no way. Like you can't even I can't put two thoughts together in that environment, and that's the point of it. People who are thinking are not into fascism. They start to realize some of the flaws.
It's funny. Trump, very early on, and I'm still sort of staggered that this is not part of the dialogue, but very early on, I think pre-2016, he said something to a room full of people that was along the lines of, I'm going to get in and the whole world's going to go crazy. They won't be able to write about anyone else. Something like that. And his instinct and insight was right. It did hack our politics in a way that we're still sort of stumbling around to get our heads around and cope with. Is there a way out? What's the way out?
It's a big question. I do think people get sick of it. Like, this is something when I'm dealing with Zoomers on social media, people that are just have this nihilistic view. I do remind them that fascist governments tend to collapse under their own weight, if nothing else. And I really hope it doesn't get to that point. I think that it would be nice to not have our society just have the economic and human rights collapses that process has happened. But I think that it is true that people sometimes, like, loud music can be fun for a while, but you do need to like turn it off eventually. I do think people get sick of it. That's my hope, because he's very one note. I think that we're already seeing some changes start to happen, which is that during his first campaign and his first administration, there really was like an inability of anyone to look away from him. And you and I both are on the side of people who can read ratings and Chartbeat and other things. And we can see that the interest, at least in the left and in the center of this country, in reading and looking at Donald Trump news is really declining, because they're just like, okay, blah, blah, loud clown being loud again. And I think that it's just a matter of more and more people just getting sick of this guy and getting sick of the just nonstop over the top outrage.
I agree. I do think it requires something close to an economic collapse to overcome the sort of structural obstacles there are to winning against this movement. Amanda Marcotte, it's really a great pleasure to talk to you as always. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.